I'm Michelle Hanratty, an IP optometrist. I'm based in the Birmingham area. I also work for Docket and the College of Optometrists. I'm a training advisor and I also present Sound Optometry, which is their podcast. So today I was asked to present a workshop on OCT, which is a core skill now, it seems, for many optometrists because it's becoming so much more widespread. Showing a patient a picture and saying to them, well, actually, your retina should be a smooth surface, but it looks like that. A picture is more than 1,000 words. And if you explain that actually it's like looking through creased cling film, they'll understand why their vision isn't as good quality as they would like it to be. I think the best way to get better at OCT is to look at lots of them, even when you think the patient's normal. So if you have got access to OCT, just do OCT on people where you're not necessarily looking for something in particular, because you'll find unusual presentations even in normals. And then when you have to explore, is that normal? Compare it to their signs, their symptoms, and their other presentations. And yes, it may be perfect, but you'll start to get an appreciation of something that looks a little bit different, but is still non-pathological and still normal. For OCT, try and be systematic. It is tempting to jump to conclusions, but if you do that, you might come to the wrong conclusion, or you might miss something else that's coexisting. If you see a dark space, is it really fluid or is it not? And therefore you do need to look at the structures around it, above and below and to the side, and always check it and compare it against your fundoscopy findings. I once spoke to a medical retina ophthalmologist, and she was saying that she always likes to compare the two side by side, go through the layers, and actually if I see something in that layer, does it translate in the fundoscopy? So always look at them together and cross-reference it with the patient history and symptoms. You can't decide that someone's got diabetic macular edema or CMO if it's not that clear cut, if you don't know the patient history. And with OCT, I think it's really good to think about it, using it to confirm what you think your diagnosis is, and not to rely on it just in isolation. And the next one was just about my experience really, where I nearly referred someone inappropriately. Again, remember your protocols. And if you're not sure, just check with someone else if you can. Check with a colleague and see what they think. It doesn't hurt to have a second opinion. Patients often appreciate your honesty. If you say, well, actually, it looks a little bit different to what I would expect. I'm just going to get my colleague to have a look as well. There's no harm in that. And the OCT can be a great tool for monitoring as well as for screening. So again, if an OCT has been done before and a patient knows they've got a condition, always repeat the scan so you can see if the condition has progressed. Because if it's not done at the next visit and something happens, the patient may question why you didn't repeat the examination. We always just think, well, if you see this is the action, and you refer. It's almost like the patient wasn't really involved in that discussion. And I think we've changed the way we approach now. It's very much around patient-centered care. You've got to make sure the patient understands what you're doing and why you're doing it. Because if you take a patient off for an extra scan and they don't know why, they could be quite scared, they could be quite worried. And if you're referring them, they might think, well, what does this mean for me? Am I going to lose my sight? So explaining what you're doing, why you're doing it, and explain that actually this isn't a formal diagnosis. This is an unusual presentation. It's different to what I expect, and we need to understand why it's different. I think we have changed how we approach referrals. We don't just make the decision, we have to involve the patient in that decision. And equally, the decision not to refer is still a discussion that you should have with the patient. And again, it's really important to explain this to patients, because they might say, well, actually, if you're saying there's nothing wrong with my eye, I don't need referral, why is my vision not as clear as it should be? Or they may have just bought some really expensive varifocals and said, well, actually, my vision's not as good as I expected it to be. And actually, they might be able to see 6/6 at 100% contrast. But actually, when they're looking at something that's that's more visually demanding, they may not see quite so well because they've got some loss of visual quality because of the epiretinal membrane. But showing them this and explaining it to them can actually be quite informative. Sometimes patients don't really understand, they can't visualize what you're trying to explain. So it's actually much better to show them the OCT. And you can explain to them that actually if you haven't got a nice even layers, then there's some disruption, so it's going to affect the quality of your vision. Patients can understand it almost instantly when you show them a picture. But when you're actually trying to describe, it's much harder. So OCT is very visual, and I think you can use that to explain to the patient exactly what's going on, or not going on, as the case may be. From an OCT point of view, there are loads of layers in the retina. And I don't know about you, but I can't remember what they all are, and I can't remember what order they all are in either. So from my point of view, I remember the hallmark layers, which for me are the RNFL, the retinal nerve fibre layer. The neurosensory retina is the big bit in the middle, between the two green markers there, and the RPE. You can get hung up on knowing what those layers are, and from an anatomical point of view, it can be quite difficult to learn what those layers are, particularly if you're not a specialist in retina, and certain conditions affect different layers. So if you're focused on one particular area that's your specialism, then you'll know about that more. But I think in general routine practice, you're not a specialist. You just need to know it's an anomaly in this location, and therefore it requires this type of management. The minutiae of what it's affecting and by how much is up to the specialist to decide. I think it's always to make sure that if you were challenged, not necessarily on a legal point of view, but if a patient's relative or a patient came back to you and said, well, why did you do that? Can you justify it? And actually, is what you've done what your peers would have done? Because there isn't always a right and wrong. In a fitness to practice investigation or challenge, you would be compared against what your peers would do. And so it's about making sure that what you do stands up to scrutiny and it can be justified. You've always got to be able to evidence why you've taken a certain course of action.